Hello. So, I hope everyone's all right. Okay. Again, strange times. I can understand anyone feeling strange in any way, shape, or form. We're all going to get through this together. One thing that we absolutely will get through together is this class. Okay. So, this week's clarification lecture is going to cover basically 1.5 days. In that, with my sincerest apologies, there was not a second lecture this week. There was a quiz off of the material, and there was also no lecture quiz as a result. So, nevertheless, let's get going on this. There were a couple of very pertinent things that came up over and over again. Okay, and I want to make sure that I cover these. There are a lot of questions about sampling, so I'm going to cover that. And there are a lot of questions about these non-experimental approaches in general. So those are the two biggest pieces that I'm going to cover. But I will also hit on a couple other pieces. Okay, sampling. Okay, so if you are doing a between subjects experiment, or actually any experiment, you need to recruit subjects. Okay, and there's actually a question about, is there a difference between participants, subjects, patients, clients? These are by and large, from the experimental standpoint, there is not a difference. Okay, there may be differences specific to specific environments that you operate in. Admittedly, my research, I've gone in some instances, I call people patients. So if they're people who are individuals suffering from some sort of disorder, I will usually refer to them as patients. And I'll usually refer to folks where I'm just recruiting people to answer questions that I find interesting as subjects. Nevertheless, you need to recruit folks for your experiments. Okay, and this can actually be done in a number of ways. Okay, if you're doing single case designs, you kind of get considerably fewer opportunities to recruit. Oftentimes, people are referred to you for one reason or another. However, if you are doing a large-scale sort of study, recruitment's a big deal. And so sampling is a major deal. And so the gold standard is what they would refer to as random sampling. Okay, so you randomly select individuals who are representative of the general population. Okay, this is an ideal. Okay, this is very challenging to do in practice. So a truly random sample, you would have just as any two people in the population would have essentially an equal possibility of being in the study. Okay, that would be ideal. And as a result, if you get a large enough group of them, it should be a super representative sample. Okay. However, not everybody actually is usually as easy to bring into the study. So oftentimes, one group or another might be particularly difficult to bring into the study. And that's why if you're going to do random sampling, you have to really think it through. Okay, so how am I going to get these harder to recruit populations? Okay, for example, often deeply underrepresented within our academic research are individuals of Native American descent, because oftentimes they are not necessarily conveniently available to researchers. Not every environment where researchers tend to recruit from has a large population of these folks, and people don't always take the necessary steps to recruit individuals of this descent. Planning is, if you want a truly representative sample, planning and dealing with these issues is very important. And so a truly representative random sample actually takes a lot of thought. It's not just kind of randomly pulling a bunch of people, because if you randomly pull names, you have to somehow come up with a way in which you're going to have an equal probability of getting them into your study. Okay, so for this reason, actually, random sampling is actually pretty rare. People will often say they're doing random sampling, but it's usually a relatively imperfect version of random sampling, wherein the populations don't always necessarily match the environments for which they tend to be recruiting from. Or they'll have to explicitly over-recruit from specific groups to try to get that. Okay. There are other approaches to sampling. Okay, from the worst to the best. Okay, so you could just say, hey, I'm going to just randomly grab some folks. Okay, you could say that's random sampling. It's not. This is what they're talking about in terms of haphazard sampling. So I decide that if I want to know about how somebody feels about some particular policy, I might do a man on the street sort of interview. Just randomly find some person who's walking by, say, "Hey, do you want to be interviewed?" Okay. Not a very well planned out approach, but it works out okay. Um, what you'll often see is kind of a hybrid between random sampling. And a haphazard sort of approach is oftentimes you'll get random sampling within a particular population, so making it a little bit easier, but your conclusions are restricted. Or stepping away from the random sampling approach, a lot of individuals tend to use convenience samples. Okay, so for example, I've done a bunch of research on decision making in college students. Okay, it tends to be something I'm pretty interested in. Doing these studies, I have about as much of a chance of getting individuals from my classes as I could get. Okay, college students in general, that's a lot of individuals. However, convenience-wise, I can recruit from people from my classes. Okay, even from my department. I have good access to these folks. I can bring them in, and hopefully, as a result of doing that, I can get the sample size that I need. But that's not a random sample. These are not random individuals. They're all so for example, that's somehow saying that the population of ABSC majors at the University of Kansas is representative of all college students out there. It's probably not true. However, it's convenient for me to do studies in this way. They call this a convenience sample. Okay? Convenience samples have something of a difficulty with generality. Okay? There's another approach you can do also. So we talked about bringing people in. Oftentimes, once we bring people into a study, we need to get them into different groups. Okay? So random sampling, then they often will want to do random assignment. So now you randomly assign individuals to different groups. The alternative to that is you can actually balance the groups so that they are not different on other important pieces. So nevertheless, so you can make sure that the ages are the same, the socioeconomic statuses are the same. If it's some sort of a cognitive task, you can make sure that baseline performance is set up to be the same between the two. Nevertheless, after sampling an assignment, you also have decisions that you have to make, and you can do it randomly or you can do it purposefully. So you can choose who it is that goes to what places. Okay. Of note, oftentimes these both purposeful assignment or purpose of sort of sampling is done because there's a population that you have interest in. Okay, so I tend to do research with college students because I'm actually interested in issues that are relevant to college students, decision making of young adults, and I sample out of this group as a result. I specifically want those folks. When I'm doing my work, for example, looking at drug addiction, I look for individuals who are suffering from drug addiction. I don't take a random sample of the population because I'm interested in a particular subset of the population. Okay. Hopefully that helped. If not, contact me and I'll still try to keep getting you there. We're going to get there. Okay. The next major piece that came up were differences in these specific non-experimental methods. Okay, so as you know, if you can do an experiment, do it. Okay, so if you can do an experiment, that is the strongest way to provide cause-effect data. It's the only way to provide cause-effect data. The information you get out of an experiment is much greater than the information you get out of any other approach you could possibly take. Okay, however, it's not always possible or feasible. Okay, so there are times where it is not in any way feasible or in any way possible, actually, to conduct an experiment. Okay, so right now we are all at home due to a stay-at-home order. Okay, I might actually be curious if these stay-at-home orders actually change the trajectory of a disease like coronavirus. Okay? It would not be appropriate for me to randomly assign folks to being in an environment in which they get the stay-at-home order versus one that they do not. Okay, it would not be appropriate for me to explicitly withhold the public health treatment that people are receiving via the stay-at-home order. Okay, so I'm in a situation where it's an interesting and an important piece that I could learn about the world. However, my experimental approaches are not something that's going to allow me to evaluate that. What do we do? Well, I can tell you when they've tried these stay-at-home orders, and if you look at it public health-wise, this is what we've done basically all the way back to Spanish flu, and if you look at it, probably even all the way back to leprosy. I can evaluate what happened. I can look at the rate of disease spread in communities that receive these stay-at-home orders versus those who don't. I, as an experimenter, did not do this assignment in any way, shape, or form. Okay? But later on, I can find the data. Okay? I can look at those data. I can compare those data. And it gives me something of, people might call it a natural experiment. It's not quite an experiment because the experimenter did not specifically manipulate these. But I can compare. I can make some pretty good comparisons. And although it's not cause-effect data, it does make a relatively strong case, particularly if you stack up enough of these comparisons to make a compelling case. That, what I'm talking about there, that's an archival study. Okay, I'm just taking data that's already there. So after all this is done, I could go look through some public databases to look at cases of coronavirus in various places, compare the trajectory of the disease in places where they did take measures versus places where they did not. Okay, but it's archival. I didn't design the system to collect these data to evaluate this. We were monitoring it in the first place. I didn't make any assignments. I just am taking advantage of the data that somebody else has taken. What's the problem here? Well, one problem is there might be problems with the data. Okay, so people may have explicitly provided lower numbers than you would expect. Okay, or used numbers that made it seem like the measures that they were using were over-representing the effect. And because I had nothing to do with the collection of the data, that's out of my hands. Okay, and that's a problem. That's a difficulty with archival data. Okay. I don't have the control that I'd like to have in these instances, and so I can't make as strong of inferences. However, if the signal's strong enough, you're probably going to be able to see something. Okay, descriptive data. I can just there are instances where I can observe things, but I cannot in any way intervene. Okay, so I can remember back when I was a behavioral consultant, there were periods of time where I was asked to figure out what was going on with folks, but there's no way, shape, or form they would allow me to manipulate conditions as you would in a functional analysis. So I can't see, hey, is he doing it more when he gets attention every time he does it versus when he's in a play condition or anything of the sort. Oftentimes, environments would not allow me to do that. Okay, so I was stuck with a couple of things. One, I could do interviews. Okay, I could sit down and talk to people. Okay, and these people have long histories, a lot to say. Sometimes they have biases in terms of what they remember versus what they don't. However, they can give me a fair amount of information. It's not experimental, so I don't have the proof that comes out of experimentation. However, it is a fair amount of information that comes here. Okay, I could directly observe what the individual is doing. So I could sit down in the corner, make myself good and hidden, and make sure that I can observe any instances of the problematic behavior, what was happening at the time, and take really, really clear notes about both what was happening in the environment and what the kid did, as well as what sort of changes in the environment happened afterwards. And I could probably see some pretty unique patterns. And I could see every time that this was happening in the environment, the kid had this. Okay. I could also see every time that the kid did this thing, I tended to see this consequence afterwards. Okay. It's not experimental proof. And so it's hard to, I wouldn't necessarily be able to say that the behavior was occurring because of this. However, it would tell me a fair amount. And if I wasn't able to do the assessment afterwards, that might be all I can get. Okay? It's a non-experimental method, but it's all that I could do. Okay? Some other questions. One, you might not be able to experiment to get at them. Two, they might be broader sorts of questions. So, for example, we've done a fair amount of work looking at sexual choices individuals make. Okay, I can tell you, doing a descriptive study with having people hide in the corner and take very clear notes is probably out of the question there. Pretty ethically tenuous at best. Okay, I really just couldn't have enough ninjas to follow people around that much. I could not, without considerable concern and effort, set up experimental situations to manipulate this. And in fact, I have a feeling that you'd have a fair amount of reactivity between the subject and the experimental environment that might give me data that are not necessarily clear in terms of what would happen in the natural environment, in terms of, for example, what they're interested in, what they're not interested in, and so on and so forth. Okay? So manipulating, directly observing things, probably out of the question. However, provided that you give the safeguards and make people feel pretty comfortable, you oftentimes can get people to answer a fair number of questions. And so if you want to understand about these sorts of decision making within a population, you can ask them questions. And this is what we talk about in terms of a survey. Okay? And surveys are not foundationally good or bad. They're good or bad based on how well they're designed, just like observation or experiments are good or bad based on how well they're designed. But you could get into information that you otherwise could not get by asking people questions. You have open-ended questions, so you can ask people questions where they get to elaborate a fair amount. Really, really hard to analyze, but you might actually get information that you wouldn't get otherwise. And that's really good early on when you don't really know what you're looking for. Or you could ask more targeted questions, close-ended questions, wherein you are asking them questions, relying on them being accurate reporters of their own behavior. Okay, and if you don't set up the environment to provide a fair amount of bias, people can sometimes be very accurate reporters. Doesn't necessarily mean that they are. Okay, these are all situations wherein you can get a lot of information from these non-experimental methods that you could not get otherwise. Okay, case studies. Okay, I have one case, something rare is happening, and I have a treatment for it. Okay. I didn't expect to have this treatment, but what I can do is I can surround what was happening there with as much data collection as possible. So as much collection on their behavior in the experimental setting, outside of the experimental setting, information about them as subjects, information from their caregivers, so on and so forth. So I wouldn't be able to get a sample large enough to do an experimental study. However, I can give really, really good accounting of what happened. That's what we're talking about in terms of a case study. Okay, case studies are common in some areas. So some areas of psychology, case studies are very common. In applied behavioral science, we see it less often. However, there can be use that's gained out of that. And one area where I've seen that these case studies are often, this sort of approach is not necessarily published but used, is back when we used to do our case reviews. When I was a clinician, I would present basically a case study to all of my colleagues for problem solving, for thinking through the case as much as possible. And I would pull in different sorts of information. I would try to provide as much background as I possibly could on that case and in that environment. This is not usually published in our research. However, clinical decision making is actually not a stranger to this. Okay, clinical decision making often will use these case studies to decide what they're doing in that particular case. Okay, I know those were the two pieces I said that I was going to cover. One thing that came up quite a bit, okay, is this issue of acquiescence. Okay, so if you are asking people in an experimental environment to do something, or in a survey to respond to a question, we are an agreeable lot. It's not just a Midwestern thing, okay? People tend to agree, okay? People tend to endorse things much higher than otherwise. Okay, that's why when you tend to look at teaching evaluations, tend to be skewed positively because people tend to want to say nice things. Okay, and in fact, you actually have to be real careful to kind of figure out how to sort through that. Acquiescence is just this tendency for people to say yes, okay? Say yes to most items. And it is an issue in experimental research, okay? It's kind of an off-growth of trying to please the experimenter, okay? It is an issue. It presents bias to experimental research and or survey research. And at best, what people tend to do is they usually try to make sure that they can see that it's happening, okay? So they might have questions in there that really almost everybody would say no to, but you can kind of pick up acquiescence based on they're saying yes to this question. Okay, so one upon a time I'd say Brussels sprouts, but I mean people actually like Brussels sprouts now. I do. You could ask people if they like black licorice. No one likes black licorice. Okay, if the people say they like black licorice, they're saying yes. Okay, or oftentimes people will present the opposite question as a catch trial. So I like black licorice. And, and you have a bunch of questions, strongly agree, strongly disagree, and then you say, I do not like black licorice. Strongly agree, strongly disagree. Those two questions should foundationally match. So if they say they don't like black licorice, they should also not say that they like black licorice. Okay, and this is what you tend to do is you try to catch acquiescence as much as possible. These are the main pieces that I wanted to make sure that we covered. I hope everybody's doing okay. Okay. Again, we are going to get through this, and I know this is challenging for everyone. We only have another, week or two left. We got a final. The paper has become optional now. We're going to get through this. I just hope everybody is feeling good. Thank you.